In this episode of the Well Aware podcast, I am super delighted to bring you Jalen Alexander of MDRC. Jalen has a very special role at MDRC. Over the past 5 years, he's been a part of the unionization efforts and is now currently union president. I can't wait to let you know more about what his journey has been like so far. Hi everyone, Conrad Ruiz here, and welcome back to the Well Aware podcast. I am here with Jalen Alexander, and today we're going to learn a lot about his world of work. Jalen, I am so grateful for you being here.
I'm super excited for this, so thanks for having me.
Yay! Folks, I have known Jalen for several years. In fact, I first met him back in New York City, back when I used to live there. And I want to say that Jalen and I made our first attempt at a podcast episode all the way back then, about, 5 years now, Jalen?
Something like that, yeah.
We've stayed in touch, and needless to say, a lot has changed in these past 5 years. Jalen, I really want to dive into what you've been doing in the past couple of years. But to kind of give us a bit of an origin story, can you tell us where it is that you work and what is it you're currently doing?
Yeah, so I work at a company called MDRC. It's a social policy research firm of about 400 or so staff based in NYC. We have offices in LA and DC as well. But we really focus on poverty and economic research. And so thinking about economic mobility, thinking about low-income workers. And this is actually MDRC's 50th anniversary. And so the org's been around for 50 years or so doing this work. I would say largely, for around government contracts. But we also do research for private entities as well. My sort of story to tell in this is I've been at MDRC for about 5 years now. And since we did our last podcast, MDRCers have decided to get organized. And so in 2021, we organized our workers and we got a supermajority of folks willing to form a union. And petitioned management to be recognized. And so that happened in 2021. And I think across this conversation, we could talk about the journey that's been our lives as a union over the past few years.
Yeah, Jalen, I think it's such a popular topic right now because we've been seeing conversations around union strikes over the past several years. In one instance, we have the Hollywood strikes, we have railroad strikers. I think for those of us who've gotten a chance to dive into the deeper history around unions and why they've been so important to our social infrastructure, for those who are in the considered working class, I think you have a very particularly unique story to tell in that you have not only been a part of this journey over the past 5 years, for instance, when you first joined and as sort of that supermajority, as you highlighted, basically formed, but now you seem to be running the show behind the union as well. So that's not a tall order, I imagine.
Yeah, I think I forgot to say I'm the union president at the moment. That, I guess, is a relevant point, too, for sure. And I do think that marker feels right. Of like 5 years or so ago, I tell people this all the time I don't feel like I would go into a bar or like meet random people and folks would be talking about either folks being on strike or folks being newly unionized. And now it's rare that on a weekend, if I meet someone new, that there isn't a conversation not prompted by me talking about a union where I meet lawyers and they're like, hey, we're organizing at our law firm. I met a lawyer a couple of weeks ago who was saying, hey, we were just talking for about an hour before he brought up yeah, we're on strike right now. And so I feel like it very much is in the daily, weekly discourse now, talking about unions, and it didn't feel like the case 5 years ago. Obviously, it happens to me a lot more often now because I'm involved in the union world. But I do just feel like, whether you're watching the news or you're living your day-to-day life, you just run into so much information. A couple of days ago, the writers of Sesame Street authorized a strike. And so it really just is, everywhere it feels like right now. It feels like, union work, union activism, workers really thinking about post-pandemic, how might we change the working life for people in the country. And so it feels very relevant and salient right now.
Yeah. And I think all the more because based on how the economic trends have been suggesting we've been living, it seems like workers' pay has just not met up with all these other responsibilities in terms of just the economic needs or standards of living. And so while, yes, on the one end, I think we can talk a little bit about how well aware in particular has viewed this standpoint, given that we are, as much as we are a small company, I'm the CEO. Most of my team is based on contract work, and they're offshore. And I've had to contemplate talking with my team about like, hey, how do you guys organize as a unit, as an entire department of people? Because they all basically function in the same way. They're all acting as these virtual assistants or virtual associates. And so what does their collective power look like when, they're sort of fighting big bad me if I'm, I think I'm a good person, right? But to me, this is also really, really fascinating. And certainly there are particular historical contexts towards the US around unionizing, around union busting, and how that's impacted our work life. But at the same time, I guess, without kind of diving too much into the randomness of that particular history, I would just love to get more into sort of where your world of work has been around this particular space, Jalen.
Yeah, so I would say because we are a nonprofit at MDRC, the private sector has operated differently in the past around unions and definitely is still operating differently. I think we're a more rare case. And so we're not an Amazon, we're not a Starbucks, right? And so we're not a sort of for-profit corporation that has a bunch of entities all across the country or the globe. And also the sort of laws are different for those sort of for-profit corporations than they are in the private sector. And I will say, to give MDRC their credit, we haven't had sort of the Amazon level, like, let's put out ads around why not to join the union, or the CEO come in and say, hey, don't do this. On the surface, MDRC has been sort of very union friendly, union inviting. It's definitely gotten complicated at the bargaining table as we talk about getting our first contract done. I think MDRC has a lot of progress to make in terms of making sure we get fair wages on the table for people and protecting benefits for our union members over time. But we're not talking about this people on a daily basis being afraid that, they're going to come in one day and say, oh, I saw you sent an email about the union. You're out the door, that sort of high level, like, of hostility and retaliation. So it's not a perfect state of being right now at MDRC in terms of MDRC isn't acquiescing to all of the things that we want in terms of making a fair workplace for all of our union members, but it's also not sort of the headlines that you would see of some of these more volatile fights for unions at bigger corporations.
Yeah. Jalen, tell me more about what your sense of the impact has been as a unionizer within MDRC. I mean, to your point, MDRC is not like most for-profits that are in particular fighting against unions and creating all sorts of use of their own profits to dismantle this type of relationship dynamic between those who are working for said for-profits and the for-profit itself, and effectively its bottom line. What's been your sense of the relationship between MDRC, its impact on society, and the fact that even within that respect of the mission, you still find yourself as a worker trying to set a tone for, what is a sustainable operation from a worker's compensation standpoint and the day-to-day job that comes with working at MDRC?
Yeah, and I think this is where the rubber hits the road, right? We have to understand that even though this is the private sector nonprofit organization, MDRC still has an interest in sort of holding on to what money they can, right? So MDRC has an endowment. MDRC has really highly paid C-suite staff, right? And so there's a big discrepancy between the highest paid folks, in which in a nonprofit space is public, that folks are getting $300,000, $400,000 a year, where when we came in and started unionizing, we had staff who were getting paid around $35,000, $40,000 a year across our administrative team. And obviously that discrepancy doesn't make sense when our administrative team members have been at the organization for 20 plus years, and they're amongst the least paid at the organization. And again, to remind you, we're talking about folks living in New York, living in LA, living in DC. $35,000 isn't livable pretty much anywhere these days. But those are folks who have been, underpaid for decades. And so obviously, and I tell this story to folks all the time, when we unionize and we, request all of the information for our staff, I thought there was an error within our spreadsheets because I saw that people were getting paid $35,000, $40,000 a year, understanding the context in which we work, the places where people live, And I was like, oh, must be an error in the spreadsheet. Can you actually tell us how much these folks are making? And it's like, oh no, actually we've been underpaying people, in certain cases below poverty wages for years as an organization whose research focuses on folks in poverty, focuses on economic mobility. And so you can see the cognitive dissonance there of like, we're telling other people and advising other folks based on research how to treat people better, how to support economic mobility, but we're underpaying a significant group of staff, and not just sort of for 1 year, but for decades.
Yeah, I could like just hear like the "Isn't It Ironic" song by Alanis Morissette just kind of like playing in the back of my mind. Like, oh my God, there's such a meta dissonance in here behind what you guys are fundamentally doing from a mission driven standpoint, which is fantastic. And then sort of like, why aren't we eating our own lunch kind of conversation?
Absolutely. And so one thing that we did to address this, so the union, and this was sort of in our, after our first year of organizing, we said, hey, we were sort of bargaining over end of year salary adjustments and raises. And we said, this is actually not acceptable. And so pre-contract bargaining, we proposed a salary wage floor increase. And so there was no sort of, people could get paid whatever, and there was sort of no minimum. And so we proposed a minimum salary floor, and we ended up winning pre-contract a $50,000 salary floor. So immediately some of those folks went up $12,000, $10,000 in pay just over that first sort of bargaining initiative. And so that felt like a really big win a couple of years ago. And again, that was pre-contract. And so that was so impactful and immediately changed some of those folks' lives, and seeing, a $10,000 increase over a year. But we're still working to improve on that. Because, $50K is still very tough in a New York and a LA, for folks with families, yet alone. I'm a single person, no dependents, and I'm like, $50K is not gonna let me live, a comfortable life in a big city. And so we're still working at that, but we made some immediate improvements, shortly after we unionized.
Jalen, those are incredible results. I mean, I'm so happy for those people. To your point, it's painful to say that it's not enough. But it is a point of gratitude, I think, to say, well, this is much better than what things used to be. And all we had to do was perform this particular operation that is called unionizing. Jalen, can you kind of walk me through, for someone who's never understood, like, what does it actually take to organize? Unionization is an operation, right? It's definitely employee-led. I've yet to see an employer, maybe there's an interesting story out there of an employer who's gone out of their way to say, hey, I want my employees to adopt this unionization operation. But what does that look like? Where do you learn how to do this type of stuff? And what does it take? What is this extra job that you guys suddenly find yourselves involved in?
Yeah, I think that's right on the money. Of it's an extra job. I also think it's sort of like running your own little nonprofit. But to start at the beginning, it's really the definition of grassroots organizing, right? And so I remember those days. And so we were largely virtual at the time, and getting a call from a coworker saying, hey, we'd love to have a chat with you about our work at MDRC. And us having a conversation, and let's say, 30 minutes into the conversation, hey, we've been thinking about, forming a union, and are trying to gather interest around, who at MDRC might be willing to do that. I was very quickly open to that idea. So I kind of got in at that sort of organizing committee level stage. And so you organize a group of 10, 15 people, depending on the size of your org. That was kind of the size of our group. And then we all got a list of all of our staff and said, who can talk to Joe? Who can talk to Sally? And we really just kind of checked in weekly to figure out sort of what the progress was. And the idea is you simply need a majority of folks willing to say yes, and what we call signing a card, which means you're kind of, signing your commitment, your email address, your address. And then we want to have a majority. We're organized under AFSCME, Council 57. And so that's sort of our national, and they gave us great advice as we started working on this effort to let's push for a super majority. And so we really wanted to be somewhere around 60, 70% before we declared to management, hey, we're going to organize, just in case people fall off. Or, MDRC at that time was an organization where people would come and go fairly quickly. And so you don't want to be sort of right there on the edge of 50% and then two people resign or something, and then you don't have the majority anymore. And so we worked to get the supermajority and secured that, and then declared that we were unionizing to MDRC.
Wow. Okay. So it really is a community operation. Obviously, there's a ton of relationship management, networking, introductions. Obviously, it's within a particular network, which is within the company itself. But still, to your point, it kind of helps to know who knows one another within said organization and who's going to be of greatest influence to be able to say, "Hey, we need you as to be part of the this team and part of this group goal because it's going to benefit all of us at the end of the day."
Yeah, that's key. It's akin to a network analysis of sorts of, who are the nodes, who are folks who know a ton of people and are really connected, who are outliers, right? And so maybe there's someone who works in a 2 or 3 person department and so isn't super socially connected to sort of folks who are in the office every day, or folks who are kind of on larger teams and just naturally run into more people. And so it really is sort of doing an assessment of your colleagues and, of your sort of, your work environment to say who can reach whom. And then in some cases, you're making cold calls and it's like, hey, I'm Jalen. We haven't met before, but I wanted to talk about how you're experiencing the company. What are some pain points? What are some things that are going well? Might you be interested in organizing? And so there were definitely a few cold calls of like folks I hadn't met, at the organization yet, but then often others that are like, hey, I know you've been struggling with this thing from a work perspective. We think a union could be helpful to kind of address these issues, right? And then plugging into sort of what are those sort of issues that folks are facing, and really like touching on that human perspective, because it really is human work to make a union operate effectively.
Yeah. So, Jalen, all of this is to say that clearly the impact of unions on the folks who are working in presumably unsustainable conditions are effectively learning how to fight for more sustainable conditions. And one could argue that as a result of that, you guys have a lot more job security, a lot more peace of mind, general employee happiness increases. Of course, and I'm going to sort of apply I call it weird because not everyone tries to empathize on the management or the executive level, right? When you're looking at this particular side of the unions. But what's been your perspective and what have been your empathies around the other side of the negotiating table? What have they been seeing? What has MDRC at large, as the company, if you will, if we're going to go ahead and follow through on Citizens United's description of what a person is, what has been your sense of the value in whether it's positive or negative, or if there's a net somewhere surrounding MDRC's position with having unionization occur within it?
I think we're doing them such a large favor, and I kind of am laughing about this because folks are talking more about salaries and experiences at MDRC, which I must say did not happen. I've been at MDRC long enough, right? So before unionizing, someone wouldn't come and say, hey, I'm making 50K. Hey, I'm making 60. We're doing the same work. Why do you think that might be? Those conversations were not happening at the lunch table, right? Those conversations were not sort of happening at sort of a group or a cohort level. Now they are. And so MDRC has benefited in that there are sort of errors within their system and sort of inconsistencies in how they recruit folks, sort of what deals they offer people on coming in, of like, if I, sort of one-off sort of bargain with, someone upon hire, I may end up getting 5,000 more than this other person who's just as qualified. And the only differentiating factor is like, I just asked for more money. That's not equitable, right? And so you have these sort of inequities that start building up within the system, and MDRC, because they're managing an entire organization, lose track of that. But what happens if you started off $5,000 making more than I did, you continue to make more than I do over time. And so now I'm 10 years in and you're exponentially making more than I am. And I'm like, wait, how did this happen? We're doing the same work. Maybe I've even advanced, promotion wise a little bit faster than you have, but you're making more money than I have. Well, if we go back to the source, it started with this inequity because of how we're recruiting people, or there's an inequity in sort of how people go up for promotions. And so we've really been able to enlighten management on, hey, there are a ton of inconsistencies here. How do we develop a better system to make this more fair for people on onset? And then also, how do we close these gaps within what we call job families, if you're thinking about sort of the growth trajectory across roles, how do we make sure that there isn't this big gap between the lowest and highest earners within a certain band?
Yeah. So how do these inconsistencies ultimately benefit MDRC? I mean, it sounds like I got the perspective where having these individuals find a stable sense of self and of professional identity by being able to recognize where their merit is across their peers, especially their like peers, and be able to say, hey, if we're of the same qualification factors, we should be making essentially the same amount. I mean, one argument that I'll make in the name of corporate is, if I'm able to get a better deal on someone who's just as qualified as someone I already have, then that saves me money. Is that just short-sighted?
It is, because you're going to have a disgruntled employee somewhere along the way, right? And so, if you think about the hours that it took for MDRC HR, for example, to have to backtrack, and they're trying to figure out the answers on, well, why did this happen? And how do we fix it? And then do I have to, if you're disgruntled enough, you may ask for back pay because there was no reason for us to have a different salary, starting rate. And so now they have to go back and calculate back pay and think about what's fair. And so it really is better for management, that corporate perspective, to get it right at onset and not have these huge gaps, because there's also no way for them to justify it, right? And so it also leads to a disgruntled workplace, because people are saying, why? There should be a reason. There should be an explanation, and HR didn't have an explanation for why these large gaps exist, why sort of folks are starting in unequal places. And so it really does, I think, by the end of this process, when we're done with the first contract, will allow HR to be able to point to a fair pay table and say, okay, this person's starting year one, they're at this level of qualification, this is what they should be making. And we'll have, it's visible to the union, visible to the person who's starting, visible to management. And that hasn't existed in the past. It's like, here's this huge range of where you may fall, but also if you argue with us enough, we may give you more than, you may be outside of that range. And obviously that just isn't sustainable as our company continues to grow.
Yeah. So in your point is that in exchange for these short-sighted wins of I'm going to get a good deal on this particular relationship dynamic, I'd rather see the benefit of having a consistency across all relationships of this type, because your expectation is that if your company is worthwhile and it's going to continue to grow, then you're going to have more of these different types of relationships. And rather than individually barter with each one, just set the tone for all of them, make sure that's equitable, sustainable for those individuals in the necessary nature of where they live and how they're going to be working. These are all decision factors you make in the realm of HR. And then as a result, you don't have to pay for all these future operations that are going to have to come about once these disgruntlements start to come around. And I mean, earlier you mentioned, the challenges on you said it from a different perspective, where you don't necessarily want to try to put together a supermajority and then suddenly have this turnover impact your ability to keep those relationships. Why does that turnover happen in the first place, if not because the relationship was unsustainable to begin with, right?
Absolutely. And I think that's something that from the union side, we haven't been able to perfectly quantify, but obviously there's a fee to not retaining folks, right? So every time that you lose someone and HR has to conduct another search, often in our industry, you're using a search firm. And so there's someone assisting you to get new hires in the door. Those are additional costs adding up, as opposed to if I just gave you that, fair 5,000 that I gave someone else up front, we wouldn't have to, let's do a new search. And then meanwhile, you're doing this search, someone else is disgruntled and they leave and they go get some more money elsewhere. So you kind of have this cycle of, when you set up inequities, either people are going to be at the company unhappy and sort of heckling you, and this is, from the corporate side, or these folks are going to leave and you have extra expenditures of people having to replace folks, having to sort of go market, doing all of that work around recruitment, doing interviews, finding staff to train new hires, right? We would much rather, have someone who's been here 4 or 5 years transition into a new role, as opposed to, well, now we have to go do a search and retrain. And so I think there's so many fringe benefits to keeping staff happy, that we just sort of recognize as people who are workers, as opposed to folks who are standing a little bit outside of that. And I think, HR doesn't like having to do searches round the clock. I was like, I think it's a benefit to them to not have to do that constantly, but I think they have to consider short term versus long term. And I think largely it's has been about the short term and reliance on folks aren't going to talk to each other. And I think MDRC is realizing we're past that point now. We share as a union that big spreadsheet that we get with all the salaries with all of our members. And so you're seeing the highest paid bargaining unit member salary, you're seeing the lowest paid bargaining unit member salary. You get to go in and row by row, see what you're making, understand if it's consistent with your peers and colleagues. And then ultimately what we're trying to win in this contract is what I spoke to before, is a pay table that makes it very clear this is what everyone slots in to this clear pay table. But before that, we've been sharing salary information in sort of spreadsheet form, again, to increase transparency.
Yeah. I want to share a little bit about WellAware's experience with this, because I'm someone who very much appreciates the concept. I mean, I hope my bias has been made very clear. I love unions. I want to share that right now within my team's operations, again, most of my teams are virtual assistants. They come from the Philippines. They're all contract workers. We very much operate on a by the hour basis for our clients, let alone for within our company internally. Mm-hmm. And that's how we kind of eat our own lunch, is by showcasing all of that. But one of the things that I'm very happy that I did many, many months ago, I worked with my bookkeeping admin VA, and she and I together ended up creating this invoice tracking spreadsheet, which on one end was just meant to show that to our VAs that, hey, because of the way our bookkeeping operations work, when we invoice our clients, they pay us. We then are able to pay our VAs. We do that on a net basis. We had some challenges in the past that if we weren't holding our clients more accountable, then I would be their credit card basically and footing the bill, and that proved to be corporate wise very, very tough on me. So when we switched that, I also said, hey, by the way, let's be incredibly transparent with how long it takes for us to get back to our VAs themselves, our providers, in terms of what we pay them. And at the same time, let's also be incredibly transparent about what are we charging our clients versus what are our VAs charging us in order to do the work. And I think what's fascinating is if I can hire a $5 per hour VA and charge $15, people look at that, they're like, oh my God, Conrad, that is an exorbitant margin change. And I'm like, look, there are tools and software that we pay for that's more expensive than our team. I think sometimes you have to look at not just the margins on a percentage basis, but just the literal dollars and how much different that is. But that's not even what I want to address. Here's where my actual humble brag becomes almost like a shot in the foot. I have this challenge right now where, as a corporate individual, I want to do my best to showcase how much I appreciate my team. $5 an hour is the minimum that we pay our teams. We've had folks come in and say, I want to do work for $250. I'm like, no, you're working for at least $5. But that being said, given our margin, if you want to look at it from just a percentage perspective, minus all the individual costs that are handled in between, there are some of our team who've asked for raises. And I've just said, yeah, absolutely. There's some who haven't asked for raises, and I haven't bothered to bring up the question for them. So as a corporate person, I do get very particular. I have that empathetic emotion with myself and my company about how do we save the most money so that we can afford to continue to grow and expand. And I try my best to show off transparently where all of our money goes as a business. But needless to say, I would be fascinated, as much as a little bit terrified, if my team were to come around to me and say, hey, Veronica's actually getting paid $7 an hour and I'm only getting paid $5. Why haven't I met that difference yet? Is it because of how long I've been here? Is it because of the quality of the work I produce? Is it because of all these things? And the reason I'm putting all this out loud here is because I would hate to find myself looking like a fool after this conversation, especially after my team is going to come in, take this transcript, take this call and listen to it and kind of look for the juicier clips out of it. I'm sure they're going to pay attention to this particular segment and go this is so meta, Conrad. What are we doing here?
We're going to radicalize your workforce.
A little bit. But still, I bring this up because it's not like I grew out of the womb knowing that this was the right thing to do, or this was the smartest thing to do, or this was the long-term most effective thing to do. I didn't grow up knowing out of the womb that I'm going to be a short-term thinker across every single capacity and operation of my business. I have an empathy towards that for people who get so busy and overwhelmed that this is the last thing they try to think about, because of course, when you're pinching time, you're as much pinching money as well. And it's so fascinating how that mindset trickles into so many poor behaviors. As opposed to rich ones, when you're looking at the broad scheme of how does a business grow and scale and think beyond itself as it currently stands. So I just want to share all of that. Jalen, what are your biggest takeaways as union president, as someone who's a part of MDRC, whose research so encompasses this concept? Again, I can't get past that irony, but I think we all will at some point and look back on it with wonder and glee. What are some of your biggest like ahas? Like, this is what we really need to be thinking about in today's day and age.
I think we have to listen to workers. I have found that there are so many insights that even our diverse, and by diverse I mean not just any sort of demographic, but across our organization, different departments, different levels of seniority, different levels, different ages. We have such a hodgepodge of folks from all across the board, both in our bargaining team and in our leadership team. Even with that, when we learn the most when we talk to members, right? When we talk to everyone. And so we've done things like when we were putting together our pay table proposal, we held sort of mini focus groups with folks like by team or by department or by specialty. And those conversations enlightened us so much about how to improve our proposals for the contract in a way that I don't think we could have gathered that information any other way. We did surveys before that and we gleaned some information and it was super helpful. But it's something about having those conversations, taking an hour, getting 10 to 15 people together and say, hey, this is how we're thinking about your work, your compensation, these benefits. What do you think? What do you say? And giving people that open space to talk back to it, to say, yes, we agree. No, we don't agree. Here's how we might modify. Those have been, I think, the most enlightening opportunities in this work. And I know that management isn't doing that, right? I know that they're not sort of sitting down with a group of people, actively listening to the experiences that people are having, understanding those pain points of like, hey, this is difficult. We may not have an answer here, but someone needs to be working on this problem. That I think that listening to the folks who are doing that work and really getting in sync with being willing to get tough feedback across the board has made such a difference. And so that's been enlightening for us as a union, for me as a union leader. But I think that that's a big note for management to take of you really have to listen to people. And I'll say that we've paid thousands and tens of thousands of dollars to external consultants to come in to do evaluations as an organization. Like, what are the issues? What are the what are the root causes of the problems at the organization? And the same thing that these reports are saying, we're getting from these members in these cohort calls and membership meetings. We're getting that feedback because those are the folks living the experience, right? Those are the people who are doing the day-to-day work. And so why push that money outwards to consultants to come in and basically interview people and put together a summary of a report that they then don't want to share transparently because the report looks really bad. Oh, we did this great report and paid people a bunch of money, but we won't share it with you because we didn't like the results. But why internally facilitate that kind of feedback sharing, and we've been able to do that. I feel so blessed to have been able to do that and to hear those stories from people. But I also know from a business perspective, we would be so much further along if MDRC had taken on this task 5 years ago, let's say.
Yeah. Jalen, I really appreciate open critique. And I want to take away that it sounds like your open call to operation is create a process by which this conversation thread is both internal, it's recurring, it's a part of the established SOPs around HR and culture management. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, this harkens back to another conversation we had, but it's sort of, you have to kind of get real. You have to be willing to get real. And I think that often, even in sort of when there are sort of open forums, if you will, from a corporate perspective, the company doesn't actually want honest feedback. They want like, oh, well, we would love like cookies at lunch. Like, they want very light touch, like give us an ice cream social every couple of weeks. And that's what they don't want to hear. Hey, you've been, underpaying people at a criminal level for many, many years. What are you going to do about it? They don't want that, you've miscategorized these folks and you've been underpaying them for 3 or 4 years. we're going to hold you, we're going to keep asking you about this until you give them that back pay. I think that companies have to be willing to get real feedback and not the request for, a holiday party. I think we really have to, I think we struggle with it, from social standpoints, but also from work environments of just like having real, honest, transparent feedback from people. I think is difficult for folks to hear, and it's something that we have to tackle if we're going to improve the lives of workers writ large, right? If we're talking about really improving work environments, we have to step out of la la land and kind of get real.
I think you've encapsulated the term sugarcoating. And I think you've also brought up an interesting point, which sort of the analogy that's been drawing in my head is this sort of parallel between when advertising and selling became less of a corporation's journey and more of a buyer's power decision, right? This is a very similar call to action that is happening towards, in this case, the buyer is the producer, it's the worker. They're the ones who are, buying money, if you will, in exchange for their time. And what their call to action is essentially is that we want more of a buyer's power around what exactly it is we are selling our time towards and what that value is worth. So I love that. And I agree that ultimately it just takes a broader segment of awareness around how this is possible, what makes it possible, what are actually the benefits across the board, not just for the workers themselves. I think that's something that corporations, whether just in short-term, in a short-term narrow-mindedness or, perhaps even in a long term, I'm very curious to see the studies. Like, I think back to Gravity Payments, and that particular, and I think his name is Dan Price. As the CEO, he created a minimum wage floor of $70,000 for all his employees for his credit card processing company. And, short of all the allegation problems that came up around Dan, I mean, that there's so much, conspiracy around like where that all actually came from and how that came to be. But he showed very clearly that when you increase the wage of those who you work with, your business can flourish. I mean, just absolutely flourish. So it's not about pricing people down and getting a race to the bottom. Like we talk about that all the time in the realm of marketing and sales. Why are we doing that internally within our own, market base of workers? It just to me, like if you're going to have a culture that resembles that, I imagine that your product offering and your pricing and the way that that's going to reflect is just going to look all the same. And at the end of the day, you're going to be nothing more than a commodity in a very unfriendly market.
I think that's very correct. And I think about two things. One, at the bargaining table now, MDRC is citing competitiveness and sort of citing that, they're saying we need to stay cheap so we can continue to win grants and contracts. And I think that it's such a narrow-minded, as you say, sort of view on what is competitiveness. Right. And so what if we paid people fairly and we attracted great talent that could also help us win more grants and contracts? Right. Why must it be let's suppress wages so that sort of the bottom, like the dollar amount looks lower. So we're more sort of appealing to these potential funders. But how about if we said, hey, we have like the best of the best researchers because we're paying enough for it to recruit the best researchers, right? And so, they're having a sustainable wage and they have a great workplace and they stay for a long time. They develop skills over time. Why isn't that the angle as opposed to we want to make sure we keep things cheap, have a disgruntled workforce as long as we're winning big contracts? And I think the other thing that you make me think about is, from a sociological perspective, there's a, social contract theory. And so, there really is this sort of deal that you're making. And so within a workforce perspective, like, yeah, I expect you to give me a paycheck, right? I want it to be fair because I'm bringing my high quality work to the table. Right now, MDRC is asking for high quality, top of the line work, but not equivalent pay. And that feels like a problem to us, right? So you want the best of the best researchers. You want folks who are sort of have done great work, but also who are going to bring all of their skill sets to the fore for MDRC's sake. But you don't want to pay them as if that's so. that feels like a problem to me. Feels like our contract is not quite jiving here. And so I think that we really have to challenge that. And that's the question that we're posing of, if you want the best, are you willing to pay for the best?
Yeah. And I think it also brings up the last question that then corporations have to answer, which is how do they play on this risk of, and this is sort of an interesting question to ask them, like, if these relationships which are in the decision-making seat have to say, well, look, in order for us to be a sustainable operation at this new caliber, our pricing has to change. You want to ask this really fascinating question, which is, in order for us to meet the actual demand that the market is placing on us, we have to charge at a price that the market itself can't afford. Why can't the market afford the value of these services at the price that it should be really realistically expecting to pay? And that brings about a whole other, I mean, obviously that's kind of how money works and how the whole flow of cash moves as a result of, who's providing the service, who's generating the benefit, and then who's generating an ROI based on that. That is all, to me, again, it's either everything rises, sure, and quality of life increases, and maybe I'm naive to say about what that actually means in an economic forum sense, or everything falls to the bottom because we're constantly competing ourselves out of a sustainable arrangement because of some sense that cheapness is the way to go. It's all about being competitive just at a price point level, not necessarily in terms of what your unique value offering is.
Absolutely agree with you. And I hope that for folks listening, I think that hope that it rings true to people that folks, as workers, we bring value. We are the value for a corporation. We are the value for a company. They don't exist. I don't agree that corporations are people, right? As sort of
such a unique conversation.
I don't believe that corporations are independently people, but we have to understand that workers bring the value, and so when you're asking for more, you're just asking for your work to be recognized, right? Like, you already are bringing value because you're a human walking into that space. We're asking for people to pay. We're asking corporations to pay for the work that we bring to the table. And so folks should not feel bad for asking for more. Folks should not feel, if they're feeling undervalued, they should feel encouraged to speak up about that. We want to make sure that, you're not harming a person because you ask for more pay. You're not harming a person because you say, hey, our benefits could be better. You're doing the service of workers. And I think that we have really guilt-tripped people in this language of corporations being the people, and the idea that you can harm a corporation as if it has feelings, right? Like, that sort of language has really guilt-tripped people into saying, well, I don't want to mess anything up because the company, and it's like, no, like, the company will be here most likely 50, 60, 70 years beyond your lifespan, right? And so you want to make sure that you're cared for and get what you deserve, as opposed to worrying about this idea of a corporation living on. That should not be our priority. We want to make sure that we're valuing the work that folks bring to the table, and more importantly, the workers, the humans that provide that labor.
Jalen, I'll leave us with this thought just for fun, and for everyone else who's potentially listening, I really hope that they have an interesting answer to this. But I was thinking about this a couple of weeks ago about how easy it is to birth a corporation, but not a child these days.
Oof. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, just the levels of complexity around what does it mean to bring another human being into this universe, and what that entails for everyone's sense of context, given all the different perspectives out there, versus like, what does it take to go register the next LLC, right? It is unfathomable what the difference is. And I get the context behind what those two things are. One is a piece of paper with the sense of corporate identity. The other thing is a living organism that, across several years forms quite a matter of sentience and can experience all manners of things. But, these are light topics. Jalen,
simple things to debate about.
Thank you so much for this time. As a friend, it is so great to see you again. And in kind, I am just so impressed by everything that you're doing. Like, these past 5 years, I wish I could have been, in New York City alongside you, getting to see more about the day-to-day behind your journey. Maybe next time we could go into more and more about, what has been your relationship to time as a person working at MDRC, and as the union president of MDRC and its union workers in kind.
I want to say I've also appreciated this. Anytime I get to see you is a pleasure. I felt at the top to say that we are Social Policy Workers United. That's the MDRC union. And so folks, if they're interested, can go to socialpolicyworkersunited.org to see our website, see our union leadership, learn more about sort of our journey so far. We're trying to wrap up contract bargaining within the next few weeks. And so I'm sure the next time we have a full chat, we'll be able to talk about sort of the whole contract bargaining process. But folks should feel free to email us, reach out to us, at Social Policy Workers United across platforms. Always happy to talk about this, especially if folks are thinking about unionizing within their own workplaces. Happy to chat about what this looked like for us.
Thank you, Jalen.
Thanks so much.